All right, welcome to the Nelson Mullins webinar on the topic of how markets and reform can reduce electricity costs in the Carolinas. One procedural thing before we get started here, there is a question box in your entry portal for this webinar. If you've got questions, type those questions in there. We're going to save probably at least 20 minutes at the end to answer questions. So as we're going along, for the next hour, type in those questions, we'll aggregate those together, and then we'll spend the last 20 minutes or so answering questions. So we've got from 12 to 1:30, and again, please send us as many questions as you can. We'd love to be able to answer those. And for the questions that we don't get to, we certainly encourage you to reach out to us on any of the questions you've got if we don't address it in the webinar. I would like to just say, before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to very briefly comment on the historical arc of wholesale energy markets in the Carolinas. Thomas Kuhn's 1962 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, provides an apt metaphor for the incipient transition in our region's wholesale energy markets. Kuhn, who was a historian of science, came up with the concept of a paradigm shift to explain how, over time, the scientific community collectively identifies anomalies that cannot be explained by the ruling scientific paradigm. These anomalies eventually reach an aggregate breaking point such that the scientific community then discards the standard paradigm in favor of the new paradigm, thus Kuhn's concept of a paradigm shift. After 120 years of IOU monopolistic control of energy markets in the Carolinas, policymakers in both states are now contemplating such a paradigm shift away from IOUs and towards RTOs for our own wholesale power markets. Numerous IOU problems are causing this paradigm shift. These IOU problems include, among other things, number one, more expensive wholesale power prices in IOU markets in comparison with RTO markets. Number two, cost overruns and cancellations in IOU large generation projects. And number three, less flexibility for large energy users in IOU markets as compared to RTO markets. Our speakers today will discuss these issues among many others, all related to deregulation. Finally, I'd like to thank several organizations that have participated in the wholesale energy market reform effort. First, I'd like to thank the Coalition for Energy Market Reform, which is housed here at our law firm, Nelson Mullins. Second, I'd like to thank the Carolina Utility Customers Association, KUCA, and its Executive Director, Kevin Martin. Third, I'd like to thank the North Carolina Clean Energy Business Alliance, NCCBA, and its Executive Director, Chris Carmody. They've all been very helpful on the wholesale market deregulation questions. Our first speaker today is Jenny Chen, who is Senior Counsel for Federal Energy Policy at Duke University's Nicholas Institute. Jenny holds a physics PhD from the University of Chicago and a JD from NYU. Previously, she served as an attorney at the NRDC and at FERC. Jenny has testified on energy issues before both FERC and the U.S. Congress. Jenny, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Weston, for that kind introduction, and thank you to Nelson Mullins for this invitation to speak on the panel today. As Weston mentioned, I'm Jenny Chen. I work on energy policy at the Nicholas Institute. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the Nicholas Institute is a non-advocacy academic think tank. We're housed in Duke University, and our role is to educate policymakers and stakeholders on relevant current issues. We have a small series of papers on competition in the Southeast, and you can find these on our website at the Nicholas Institute. The paper that I'm going to discuss today is on evaluating options for enhancing wholesale competition, and it focuses on wholesale competition options that don't change the vertically integrated utility structure. Also, the focus is on the Southeast because the stakeholder discussions have expressed interest here, and so we can go to the next slide. First, I would like to provide a little bit of a visual of the big picture of the current situation in the United States. The US grid is divided into many balancing authorities, represented by circles on this map. The balancing authorities are responsible for ensuring electricity supply and demand are in balance, helping to stabilize the grid at a frequency within a required range in real time, and integrating resource plans ahead of time. Balancing authorities can be regional transmission organizations, or we say RTOs for short. So these could be PJM, MISO, SPP, as you can see, with the larger circles. And the larger circles do represent larger areas or larger balancing authorities where a greater amount of supply and demand are being balanced. The balancing authorities can also be groups of utilities, whether there are groups working together or individual utilities. These are the smaller circles. The trend in the US has been toward merging these balancing authorities into larger balancing authorities. And the benefit has been that the economies of scale and diversity of supply and load can help decrease costs and help ensure reliability. So, for example, on the supply side, when we're speaking to wind and solar, which are variable renewable resources, wind and solar can be strong at some point somewhere, but without a larger balancing authority, some of the low cost wind can be bottled up, for example, in the mid-continent, and as a result curtailed and inaccessible to neighboring states. A diversity of load can also help. So for example, if you have a balancing authority that covers a larger region, you have different time zones. Morning and evening peaks can occur at different times. And regions don't necessarily all have the same temperatures during a heat wave or a cold snap. Next slide, please. I'd like to walk through the framework and an example application from the paper. So what the paper does is it sets up a framework to evaluate options and provides some background on how various options work and how they would compare to the status quo vertically integrated utility in the Southeast. The idea is to enable stakeholders or policymakers to run through this exercise for yourself in light of your own goals. The first step is to define your goals. So that could be investing in clean energy, enabling consumers to achieve greater savings, enabling consumer choice, improving reliability, especially in the face of extreme storms, or creating new jobs. So it could really be a whole host of different goals depending on what your priorities are. Then the next thing to do is to list the factors that are helpful for achieving the goal and define some metrics for evaluating whether or not the goals, the various options are helpful in achieving those goals. So these factors could be things like price transparency, access to renewable areas with high renewable potential areas, access to revenue streams, or the ability for the power system to accommodate variability in wind and solar, for example. The paper then describes 3 sets of options. So RTOs, or regional transmission organizations, energy imbalance markets, we shorten that to EIMs, or power pools. And the paper breaks down each option, which is really a package of elements, into basic grid operator functions. What I mean by grid operator functions would be things like committing power plants in advance, dispatching their output in real time, or scheduling their dispatch a day ahead, the interconnection process that they administer to connect new generation, transmission planning, resource adequacy planning or coordination, which is the ability to plan for the future and ensure that you have sufficient generation commitments to maintain reliability on your system, and maintaining reserves. We also discuss the governance of each type of grid operator entity, such as RTOs, EIMs, or power pools. The base case for comparison would be your utility or whoever handles grid operations. I used what might be a typical Southeast vertically integrated utility, although we know that there's a lot of variation. Then the paper goes on to evaluate each function against the metrics compared to the status quo vertically integrated utility. This enables us to see the parts of each option that are helpful or not in achieving the goal. Next slide, please. So this slide provides an example of if, for example, your goal is to encourage new non-emitting investment, for example, in renewable energy. So the factors helpful in achieving new investments in renewable energy or other non-emitting technologies could be whether the option facilitates access to renewable resources. So access would include the ability for renewables to timely interconnect to sufficient transmission and distribution infrastructure, as well as a footprint that encompasses high potential areas for renewables. Every region in the United States has renewable resources, but developing them in a timely manner has been a challenge in part to the generator interconnection process. Even in regions where renewables are abundant and cheap, there are infrastructure and trading constraints to moving that electricity to customers. The next point is on whether the option increases access to financing and revenue streams compared to the base case. These could include access to contractual arrangements from credit-worthy buyers, revenues from separate electricity services, and investments, an investment environment that doesn't artificially retain older, inefficient generation. The next bucket is on whether the option facilitates sufficient power system flexibility and cost-effectively smooths renewable variability, for example. So larger systems typically offer a wider variety of resources that contribute to greater flexibility. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. The next bucket is on whether the option facilitates clean energy policies that helps achieve emissions reduction goals. While economics can influence the uptake in clean energy, policies have also been a significant driver. The next bucket is on whether the option provides accurate and timely information important to developing new resources. Such information can include transparent energy prices, the cost of generation that's built and dispatched. This information can help parties seeking to contract, for example. Transparent interconnection process and costs and timely approvals can also help project development. The last bucket is on whether the option is governed in a way that enables or facilitates necessary changes. This is on governance, and this could include meaningful oversight and accountability, as well as the ability for non-incumbent interests, such as those of newer non-emitting technologies, to influence decisions. Next slide, please. So here we have a Frankenstein map of the Western energy imbalance market plus the map of regional transmission operator organization participants. I don't have a map that really seamlessly integrates the two. So while you marvel at the seams issues in this map, I will describe some of the prepackaged options. So the regional transmission organizations run real-time and day-ahead energy markets. So these include scheduling resources to be online a day ahead for each hour of the next day, plus finding the lowest cost, most efficient resources to dispatch every 5 minutes of the day. RTOs also operate ancillary service markets, which are markets that include reserves or other services that keep the grid in balance to ensure short-term reliability. Regional transmission organizations also coordinate resource adequacy across vertically integrated utilities or run capacity markets for restructured utilities. RTOs also independently operate the transmission facilities owned by the utility members. And if I didn't mention this before, but the utilities can be either restructured or vertically integrated. Lastly, the RTOs also conduct regional transmission planning. So they do transmission planning over a greater footprint. The energy imbalance markets, you can see the participants in the Western energy imbalance market on the left side of this map. They are voluntary. So the energy imbalance market is a real-time energy market that is run by, in this case, the California Independent System Operator, CAISO. The participants are voluntary utilities that have signed up to sell their excess electricity or buy electricity from CAISO's real-time energy market. The real-time energy market is really only about 5% of the total energy market transactions. The rest is in the day ahead. And the energy imbalance market is only a subset of grid operator functions. So the rest of these grid operator functions are still handled by the utilities in the in this Western footprint on this map. The Southwest Power Pool, which is really a regional transmission organization, had a legacy and energy imbalance service that became the integrated marketplace that it has today for the Eastern interconnection. And Southwest Power Pool will also launch a energy imbalance service in the Western interconnection. We also have power pools, but these are varied. Some developed into regional transmission organizations, for example, with SPP, and some dissolved because they're not really formal agreements. Next slide, please. No, and by that I meant not all power pools were formal agreements, so they could more easily dissolve. On the next slide, we have a super concise summary in table form of really what's a lot of text in the report, discussing an example application of metrics/factors for spurring clean energy investment. You can see these factors listed on the left column. The options are across the top, and you can see that they are the regional transmission organizations, energy imbalance markets, and vertically integrated utilities as a standalone base case. Power pools are really just too varied as a category to consider as a packaged option, but so we didn't include those in this table. Some of the quick highlights I'd like to point out, and for the rest, you might want to read the paper because there's a lot of detail behind each of these points. The RTOs really benefit from security constrained economic dispatch. And this SCED is what you see on the table. That's the unit commitments and dispatch process. And it provides a lot of benefit for transparency, like price transparency at each time and at different locations. And it also improves the flexibility of the system because it's constantly seeking the resources that are the least cost every 5 minutes in the real-time market. RTOs offer a larger market, which facilitates low-cost power system flexibility, as well as enable greater access to renewable energy. Some of the challenges include capacity markets, but we have seen in the past with RTO formation or with new entrants into RTOs that oftentimes a new entrant can negotiate better terms for themselves and sometimes even more broadly for the states generally in order to provide input into the decision-making process in RTOs. For the energy imbalance market, some of the benefits include a bigger footprint than potentially than regional transmission organizations because the requirement to ensure contiguous borders is somewhat relaxed. But the EIM really only has a real-time energy market at this time, and it's really only voluntary participation. So the utilities really have to want to be there in order for this to be a success. They've demonstrated, the EIM has demonstrated success in avoiding curtailments of existing renewable energy, but we would need more data to see the impacts on spurring investments in new renewable builds. Vertically integrated utilities have standalone. You can see that they are a little bit more coordinated in terms of ensuring that generation and transmission planning can go hand in hand. But these elements so far for renewable energy for the most part, has not been significantly leveraged throughout the Southeast. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide. It just has some super high level preliminary takeaways based off of the illustrative run through of the framework in the paper. And some of the points that I'd like to highlight here are that it appears that enhancing competition through a regional organized market can lower wholesale costs, provide non-incumbents, such as new renewable developers that are not affiliated with the utility, easier access to the system and be able to sell their energy into the system. It can also improve system efficiency and flexibility. Wholesale competition and regionalization are important in the long run for a more flexible and low emissions grid, but the market and infrastructure changes alone can't guarantee particular outcomes or targets, especially in the near term. So for that, policies are very important. And it's really important that, that the markets and policies work hand in hand. And they can, but it's something that's a work in progress. The organized regional markets offer relatively more transparency, educational training, and market monitoring than the traditional model of vertically integrated utilities, which are also important for customers and non-incumbent generators. So that's it for my slides, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Jenny, thanks very much. That was great. I would just say to the audience, please keep your questions coming. We see them rolling in on our screen here, but the more the better, so continue that. And we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. The second speaker is Rachel Wilson, who is a principal associate with Synapse Energy Economics, a research and consulting firm. She was educated at Claremont McKenna and the Yale School of Forestry. She has more than a decade of experience in electrical and natural gas sectors and now primarily focuses on issues related to utility integrated resource planning. Her clients include state and federal regulators, resource developers, and nonprofit organizations. She has testified before numerous state utility commissions on a variety of energy issues. Rachel, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here today and for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about a study we did that analyzed the benefits to Duke Carolinas and Duke Progress of joining PJM. And I'm going to refer to these companies collectively as Duke Energy in this discussion just for the sake of ease. So on the next slide, I've included just a little bit about Synapse and what we do. And for the next slide, it introduces the context of the analysis that we did. So we've seen evidence from studies done by other utilities that RTO membership has economic benefits for ratepayers. And we've seen similar evidence from Duke itself in the merger between Carolinas and Progress. One of the conditions of that 2012 merger was that Duke deliver $650 million in savings to customers over 5 years as a result of projected fuel and joint dispatch savings. And that new utility would schedule and operate its generation plants as a combined fleet in order to obtain maximum efficiency, which is where those savings would come from. So then in the context of bigger is better, which Jenny touched on, imagine if Duke were to join PJM and the quote combined fleet became that much larger. A high-level study done by the Brattle Group, estimated that Duke's North Carolina customers could save up to $600 million annually if it were to join a regional wholesale power market. Next slide, please. Integration with PJM would entail ceding some control over the planning, operations, and cost of the electric power system to that RTO, and through it to the other states in which that RTO operates. All of those stakeholders have input into the design of the wholesale market tariff that is approved by the FERC, as well as the myriad details involved in planning for and operating the system. Benefits of RTO membership include reduced cost of power, increased reliability, reduced emissions through increasing renewable energy integration, and enhanced system operations. But joining a wholesale market is not synonymous with retail choice. States can retain the monopoly utility model and still allow the utilities located within that state to join and benefit from RTOs. Dominion Energy in Virginia is one example of this. So Duke Energy could thus continue to own generation while relinquishing its role as grid operator to PJM, participating in the wholesale market, but not necessarily using market signals to guide all of its behaviors. So Duke would still be subject to state regulations like the North Carolina Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Portfolio Standard and the Integrated Resource Planning rules. State regulators would continue to approve Duke's investments, and the costs of these investments, along with any market revenues, would still be recovered from the company's ratepayers. Those costs should be lower, though, because of the benefits of RTO membership and the fact that they include access to the lowest cost production of electric power in any given time frame. Next slide, please. So then we're going to move into some of the methodology behind the draft synapse study. Synapse prepared an analysis for the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association for use in the 2018 Duke IRP dockets. We used an electric sector capacity expansion and dispatch model called Encompass to compare two scenarios. The first was the Duke IRP scenario, which included the capacity additions specified by the 2018 Duke IRPs. This included 9,000 megawatts of new simple cycle and combined cycle combustion turbines and 3,000 megawatts of planned solar. In the clean energy scenario, we removed what are called must-run designations from certain of Duke's coal units that had them and allowed for economic dispatch of all coal. We included an advanced energy efficiency program modeled as a supply-side resource and priced at the levels outlined in Duke's 2016 DSM market potential study. Our projected load included the increased electric demand associated with the electric vehicle goal established in North Carolina Executive Order number 80. And lastly, rather than building new gas, we allowed Encompass to optimize a renewable build-out using capital and operating costs taken from the mid-case of NREL's 2018 Advanced Technology Baseline Report. Next slide, please. So that was the previous study. And then in this study, we used this rigorous scenario-based framework to create a third case that evaluated the benefits of the utility joining the PJM interconnection. We assume that Duke Energy joins PJM and we remove existing hurdle rates for transfers of capacity and energy between the two. Our previous study had given battery storage resources a capacity credit of 75%. But that credit was lowered to 40% in this new scenario when Duke joins PJM to reflect the existing market rules. This unpublished study assessed two primary questions. First, what's the benefit to customers if Duke joined PJM? And second, what are the benefits to Duke? We compared those scenarios using the metrics listed here. Capacity changes, energy dispatch, production cost, energy market prices, and emissions. So next slide. On to the study results. So first, this slide shows the capacity differences in 2019 and in 2033 in the IRP and market scenarios. You can see that the Duke IRP scenario relies heavily on new gas capacity, as I just talked about as part of our assumptions. At the end of the analysis period, fossil resources make up 56% of Duke Energy's portfolio in that IRP scenario. This scenario adds solar PV and battery storage resources to comply with the North Carolina REPs and with House Bill 589. Then in 2033, renewable resources make up 22% of total capacity in Duke's service territory in that IRP scenario. In contrast, the market scenario allows the Encompass model to select the most cost-effective future resource build and build out solar and storage resources. We lost our slides. We're on slide 10. Oh, sorry, it's my slide 10. Yep. Yep, there we go. Okay. So Encompass can select the most cost-effective future resource build, and it builds out solar and storage to meet future demand. The total amount of renewables used to meet capacity needs more than doubles in the market scenario, and fossil capacity drops from 56% to 32% of the resource portfolio in 2033. Then the other notable difference is that we see increased capacity purchases when Duke is part of PJM. Next slide. So here we see the difference in generation over time in the IRP and the market scenarios. And there are a few things that jump out when we're comparing these two figures. First, when coal dispatches economically into the PJM market, we see generation from coal fall dramatically, such that coal makes up only 1% of generation in the market scenario. Second, we see generation from gas gradually decreasing over the analysis period in the market scenario, while generation from solar is increasing. Duke also becomes a net importer in the market scenario, largely due to the availability of excess capacity in PJM. Next slide. Here we see the production costs associated with the three scenarios. The IRP scenario has the highest production costs of the scenarios that Synapse modeled. The clean energy scenario has lower production costs due to the decline in coal generation and the increasing penetrations of low and no variable cost resources. Consistent exposure to the competitive wholesale market continues to drive down those generation costs over the modeled time horizon in the market scenario, resulting in savings of just over $2.5 billion per year by 2033 compared to the Duke IRP scenario. And those production costs in the market scenario are even lower as a result of this regional dispatch that happens as part of PJM. So Duke imports energy when the average wholesale cost in PJM is lower than the average cost of generation for the company. Therefore, Duke would end up buying a percentage of its power from PJM to the benefit of all customers. Because of the availability of lower cost power in PJM, particularly during hours when the sun isn't shining, Duke could use imports to defer building gas capacity and meet increased demand with renewable energy. Next slide, please. Synapse calculated wholesale electricity costs as Duke's production cost, which is fuel plus variable O&M costs, plus the cost of imported energy. Dividing the total of those values by sales to customers gives the wholesale energy cost in cents per kilowatt hour. This chart shows those costs over the course of the analysis period. They stayed just below 5 cents per kilowatt hour in the Duke IRP scenario, but declined gradually in the market scenario, which is that red bar, to just above 3 cents per kilowatt hour. And so by 2033, wholesale costs in the market scenario are 30% lower than in the Duke IRP scenario. And this translates into customer savings. So next slide, please. And I'll just finish now with a few conclusions. So first, unsurprisingly, membership in an RTO like PJM has net benefits to Duke Energy and to its customers. Regional economic dispatch of generating units lowers total production costs, and this directly benefits customers in the form of lower electric rates. Given the production cost savings associated with membership in PJM, using the competitive market to meet generation needs can make capital available to Duke for alternative investments without heavily impacting customer costs. Grid modernization initiatives are one such example of an alternative investment that Duke could make, and that could still result in lower rates through the expansion of distributed resources integrated onto the grid. Duke would be able to invest the capital that otherwise would have been spent in new gas-fired self-build resources in the electric grid, meaning transmission and distribution. And they could do that in ways that are more meaningful for long-term integration of clean energy technologies and customer cost minimization. So work on this topic is ongoing, and we're currently in the process of evaluating additional scenarios of RTO integration using updated assumptions. So watch out for our results. Then the next slide just has my contact information if you are interested in learning more. Thank you so much. I look forward to any questions that you might have.
Rachel, that was great. Thank you for that. And next up is my law partner, Steve Shparber, who is in our DC office. Steve is currently, most notably, outside counsel to both AWIA and SIA for FERC and RTO issues. He previously practiced in-house at PJM and also was in-house at FERC. Steve, I'll turn the mic over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Weston, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in on a Friday afternoon. Hope that everyone's healthy and doing well during these interesting times that we're all living in. And also had, my past time at FERC, had the pleasure of actually being a law clerk in the ALJ's office at FERC with Jennifer Chen. So that's where I know Jenny from, and it's always good to be on the phone with Jenny and everyone else on the panel. So what I'm going to be focusing on today will be really looking at what are the pros and cons of integrating into an RTO, especially from the consumer and renewable perspective. I think this is interesting because consumers tend to have lower costs, and renewable generators and renewable power independent power producers tend to like higher prices. But overall, I think what's interesting is that for both renewables and consumers, RTOs are a net benefit, and just wholesale deregulation in general is a net benefit to both types of entities. And even though RTOs by no means are perfect, I probably would not have much of my job if they were. But the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. And I think, as I mentioned, on balance, RTOs are very good for both consumers and renewables. So I'm going to be going over this in a little more depth, the consumer and renewable perspective, and also a bit of an overview for an RTO. And also importantly, summarizing before Jamey Goldin's presentation some key issues that all stakeholders should be thinking about as the question of wholesale deregulation really continues to percolate in the Carolinas. Next slide, please. So first, let me start with a brief overview of RTOs. I'm going to actually go through this relatively quickly because Rachel and Jenny did such a great job. Next slide, please. So as we mentioned here, here's the map of the RTOs themselves. I think we've been talking about PJM so much because to the extent there's going to be the potential integration into any RTO for the Carolinas would most likely be PJM. As you can see, part of North Carolina is already in PJM. But one thing I want to touch on is even though there are, 7 different RTOs in the country, not every one of them is the same by any means. And so I think the reason that's important is because as the Carolinas start to think about what's best for their energy future, there may be different options available. So for example, and not so much necessarily, whether, the question about whether you would want to form your own RTO, whether you do the energy and balance market operated by an RTO, a full-scale integration into an RTO like PJM, or, for example, integration into PJM maybe with some conditions. There are a lot of different options out there. So this is an enormously complex case. There's definitely not one RTO that fits all. And so just something to be aware of. I think also another thing to be aware of is when we talk about capacity markets, and I am actually going to touch on this in some depth later because they do have important indications for both renewables and consumers. I'm really talking about the capacity markets that are mandatory in restructured states in PJM, New York ISO, and ISO New England. MISO does have a residual voluntary capacity market, but it's a little different. It's not the same as the mandatory capacity markets of the Eastern RTOs. And then SPP, ERCOT, and California do not have capacity markets. So just something to bear in mind as we're talking about capacity markets later, we're really talking about PJM, New York, and New England, even though technically MISO does have a residual one. Next slide, please. Okay, so this actually is a really great, I think, illustration of just visually what we're talking about between a vertically integrated and a wholesale restructured market. So as you see in a vertically integrated market or a vertically integrated structure, you have each utility that owns generation, owns the transmission, the distribution that goes directly to the end use customer. In the wholesale restructured model, what you have are typically independent power producers that are not affiliated with the actual utilities, or rather, what I will say is, they're separate entities. So, for example, certainly companies like Duke Energy, there are affiliates like Duke Renewables that are generation only. That is allowed, but really, we're talking about it's not a vertically integrated situation like you have currently, like in the Southeast. Just something important to point out. But effectively, you have independent power producers that produce the electricity. The RTO or ISO in here, it's the same thing functionally, actually is responsible for operating the bulk power system and really involved in the transmission components. But there's still a very important role for the utilities. As you can see, the utilities A, B, and C are still have an important role to play over the distribution of power and the supply of power to end-use customers, which are represented by the homes here. So the other thing that and I think this really touches, it's shown in the visual, is that when we're talking about wholesale deregulation, we're really talking about the top two figures. Retail choice, retail deregulation, you're really talking about the relationship between the distribution side and the utility and the end-use customer. So that's why when we're talking about how retail deregulation of those sorts of questions are outside the scope of responsibility from RTOs, and the question of wholesale deregulation, it is a separate thing. So I think it's actually, demonstrated here in part by the visual. But this is a good visual for showing what the different structures are. Next slide, please. Okay, so another thing we're just going to talk on is why RTOs are best for an evolving resource mix. These principles are actually taken by a paper that was written a few years ago by Rob Gramlich. I was also a contributing author to it. But what RTOs can do for an evolving resource mix, and this is good for both customers and renewables, is that, and these are the guiding principles that we came up with. One is flexibility. The RTOs can facilitate fast dispatch and prices based on real-time value, closer to the real-time commitment of energy. What that can do is provide more price transparency into when generation needs to be turned on or turned off, and closer to what the customer's needs are, and that provides a more accurate view of when generation needs to turn on and off and respond to different needs of the customers on the system. Fair is that RTOs tend to facilitate technology neutral participation. FAR, and this has been talked about previously, the fact that large geographic area facilitate better trading and help integrate multiple types of resources. And then free, which is very interesting. I'm going to get into this a little bit later, but that RTOs do facilitate, because they're wholesale markets and because there's price transparency, it facilitates more bilateral contracting that are easier to enter into between customers and wholesale customers and generators. And there are also enhanced demand side participation options that can also lower costs for consumers. So RTOs are really set up well to facilitate an evolving resource, to incorporate and facilitate an evolving resource mix. They're by no means perfect, but these are principles that RTOs and many times do live up to, and then in some cases are aspirational, but they overall are better at facilitating an evolving resource mix compared to vertically integrated utility model. Next slide, please. Okay, so first I want to touch on the consumer perspective. Next slide. So this has been touched on before, but RTOs really do, one of the key things they do is that, as pointed out earlier, is they reduce wholesale costs for consumers considerably. And when we're talking about wholesale costs, we're talking about wholesale generation rates for electricity, transmission, and operations. PJM, this is taken from a few years ago. PJM did an estimate and believes that its total value to customers and to the states and consumers results in annual savings between $3.2 to $4 billion a year. MISO has a similar estimate of $3.2 to $4 billion a year compared to standard industry practice. And SPP in 2018 estimated that its services provided a net savings of $2.2 billion annually to customers. The next slide actually taking, if you can move to the next slide, please, goes into, this is what PJM did, like I said, in 2017, breaks down where the savings come from. Some comes from more efficient investment in generation. There are also energy production cost savings, lower emissions, and where PJM got this from is facilitating the switch from coal to natural gas units, and then integrating more efficient resources and increased reliability. That PJM has a paper on this, but this from a few years ago is how PJM estimated that there would be an annual savings of $3.2 to $4 billion a year just from being integrated into PJM. Next slide, please. Great, and then what we have here, and this is similar to the conclusions Rachel drawn. This shows the historical perspective looking at wholesale costs of electricity, comparing PJM to different southeastern utilities. You can see PJM versus Santee Cooper, Duke Energy, Carolinas, Georgia, and NextEra. And as you can see, the wholesale cost of electricity historically, and we have numbers here through 2017, so the last few years have not been, we do not have that, but as you can see, historically, the PJM prices are substantially lower, and that is even with the fact that, you know, if you ever hear any discussion about wholesale rate volatility and the fact that the prices in the energy market change actually in PJM every 5 minutes, technically in real time, you can see that there are ways to contract around that, and I can get to that later. But as you can see, even with, you know, quote unquote price volatility in the wholesale markets, they are substantially lower than compared to other vertically integrated utilities. Next slide, please. And specifically vertically integrated utilities in the Southeast. Okay. Next slide actually goes into another core function of RTOs, and which is important to consumers, which is reliability. This is a table that actually compares reliability metrics from several of Duke's affiliates. Just the state that it's in, and also whether the state is in an RTO. So Duke Energy Kentucky and Duke Energy Ohio are both in RTOs. And these reliability metrics which deal with and address, you know, outage rates and duration of outages. The important thing to note is that lower score is better here. And as you can see, and this is from 2016 as it says, but based on this publicly available information, the Duke affiliates that are in RTOs, their reliability metrics are on par, where they're in most instances much lower than the Duke utilities that are compared, that are, pardon me, that are vertically integrated. And a large reason for that, as Jenny and Rachel pointed out, has to do with the fact that you know, you have reliability benefits by operating a system over a broader geographic region. Now, certainly, you know, there are other contributing factors that go into this, and you know, it's not like, you know, being in an RTO solves all reliability issues. However, as can be shown, as can be seen, pardon me, from here, the reliability of the RTOs is really important to the RTO's functions. And as you can see here, even looking at Duke's data from a few years back, their affiliates that are in RTOs have superior or at least comparable reliability to the vertically integrated affiliates. Next slide, please. Okay, so with this, I've talked a lot about what's so great about RTOs from the consumer perspective. There are potential challenges, and I'm actually going to have a discussion with capacity markets later on, and there's more information on the slides, but just from the consumer perspective, as I mentioned, wholesale market energy prices can fluctuate. However, contracting long-term PPAs are often in place to help hedge that risk, so that even though wholesale energy market prices fluctuate, the actual costs that are paid by consumers can be relatively stable. In fact, one of the main reasons that so many large buyers are looking to enter into wholesale markets, and especially long-term PPAs with renewables, is because they can effectively lock in price to shield themselves from any volatility. So it's the contracting that in the private enterprise that actually helps stabilize prices, even if prices in the wholesale markets actually do fluctuate. Another challenge that I will say is that markets are complex. As I noted earlier, it is a very different paradigm from the vertically integrated. They're vertically integrated markets, so large consumers, especially, are represented in stakeholder processes, but they are more complex. It's a different environment compared to the state commission and vertically integrated paradigm that Carolinians are most used to. Doesn't mean that the learning curve is insurmountable. It's just saying if any sort of transition from a vertically integrated paradigm to an RTO, there will be a learning curve. Another question, and this is from a consumer perspective, are what would be the transition costs associated with going from a vertically integrated model to a deregulated wholesale model? And that's something that stakeholders will have to definitely think about as they're examining options for integrating into an RTO or different types of wholesale deregulation. The transition costs are something that do need to be considered. Although, as Rachel correctly pointed out, the overall cost savings are certainly outweigh. Our understanding is that the overall cost savings long term would most likely almost certainly outweigh those transition costs. However, that is something that needs to be addressed and thought about by stakeholders moving forward for sure. Next slide, please. Great. Now, briefly, I want to touch on the renewable perspective. Next slide. So why are RTOs generally better for renewables compared to vertically integrated utilities? So the first thing is that the larger geographic areas and the better operations, the more flexible operations, really do a much better job at integrating the intermittency of renewable resources and lowering integration costs. And also, as Jenny pointed out, even in the case of EIMs, lowering curtailment. There's also price transparency that enables better investment decisions and that allow, as I mentioned earlier, large customers and power marketers to directly contract with one another. And the open markets allow for a variety of contract structures for renewables to directly contract with corporate buyers. In the next few slides have a summary of these. I don't want to spend too much time going over them because of time, but next slide, please. So the next few slides just go over the differences between direct and financial PPAs. The key takeaway here is that, and please refer to the slides for more information, but if you actually go to the next slide after this, the important thing to note is that the RTO structure enables the indirect or virtual PPA in many instances. There are other contracting structures, but basically you need an RTO in order to enter into these structures. You do not have the same ability to contract directly with end-use customers in a vertically integrated market. And even in EIM markets, it's tougher to actually go and contract. So, to date, we see the explosion of renewable growth and especially direct contracts with end-use customers. Those are all in RTO regions for the most part, unless you're in a green tariff situation, but that's separate. But however, in order to have a green tariff, as many of you are aware of, that actually requires the utility to set that up. You cannot go directly to the end-use customer like you can in an RTO. Next slide, please. Great. And next slide, this slide just shows how it contracts for differences. The cash flow works. Next slide. Okay, so wanted to have a note on capacity markets because they are something that come up quite a bit that are pretty controversial, but just go over what they are. So what capacity markets are, they're intended to send price signals for investment in new generation on a regional scale and signal when economically inefficient resources should retire, and they effectively assist with resource planning on a regional level. I personally believe that capacity markets in and of themselves are not bad, nor do they hamper, do they necessarily need to hamper renewable growth, or do they necessarily need to raise prices on consumers? I will say, though, that the way they have been implemented recently in some recent FERC decisions have definitely have had negative implications for both renewables and consumers. And so there is a tension between capacity markets and state policy supporting specific types of generation resources. And really where this all came out of years ago was actually started with Illinois support for nuclear resources. However, in states like the Carolinas, where if you're looking for helping growth of renewables, if you're looking at the growth of renewables where there's less dependency on things like RECs or different types of direct and indirect state subsidies, the tension between state policy and capacity markets isn't as prevalent compared to maybe if you're in a state that is mandating large amount of renewable energy. So the reason this is important is because FERC has actually in recent years ordered price supports for generation and more traditional generation in PJMIs, New England and New York. And there are continuing to be a discussion at stakeholder levels about capacity market reforms and appeals. I can't get into too much right now because I am outside counsel to lead and see and involved in these proceedings. But I think it's fair to say that what's going on with capacity markets in the Eastern RTOs and the discussion will continue and certainly is not done. I think what's important to note, though, for everyone's knowledge, both consumers and renewables and the general public, is even despite these recent actions by FERC, capacity prices have not actually risen. So a few months ago, ICE New England ran its first capacity markets with what they call the Casper model in place, but one of these regimes that actually was widely criticized for improperly raising prices on consumers and targeting renewables. And their recent auction with those rules in place actually cleared at a record low price and was actually 50% lower than the previous year. So I think what this shows you is that despite controversy around the capacity market, the overall structure of RTOs is still lowering prices on consumers. Supply and demand fundamentals still mean something. And while each of the RTOs have a different capacity market structure in place, it's by no means eliminated the ability for renewables to be developed in those RTOs. If you look at the interconnection queues of all the RTOs, especially PJM, a lot of it's solar, a lot of it's storage, a lot of it's wind, and so renewables are still continuing to develop in these RTOs, and also the price impact for consumers has not been has not ballooned, at least in the first auction in ICE New England. It was also important to note is that capacity market revenues for renewables and especially solar do represent an additional and significant cash stream that can help with financing, and so it's an important driver moving forward potentially for renewable investment. So all that is to say about capacity markets is that it should not preclude discussion of what should be next for the Carolinas, although it's certainly an important topic to be considered by all stakeholders. So I think that's the important note on that. Next slide, though, please. Okay, so next I want to go over the potential challenges for renewables in RTOs. Just to summarize this. So first of all, there is less of an ability to rely on PURPA. For some people, that may be a good thing, but PURPA and RTOs effectively, unless for very small projects, isn't as applicable. Generally, renewables are developed that rely upon wholesale energy market clearing prices and entering into bilateral contracts. PURPA, and especially the requirement that utilities purchase renewables like you have in much of the Southeast is not as prevalent. And especially also with PURPA being reformed at the federal level or those discussions taking place, RTOs actually for renewables may turn into a positive because, if you can't rely on PURPA, then it's best just to go to the open market. But even today in RTOs, relying on PURPA and avoided cost, it's not as important to the development of renewable projects for the most part, especially the larger projects. As I mentioned also, recent FERC precedent does make it potentially more challenging for states and RTOs to meet policy goals around capacity markets. However, as I mentioned earlier, for the Carolinas, which to date has been less reliant upon policy in order to actually develop renewables, and maybe less of a concern moving forward. Although certainly something to be considered and thought of. Also, stakeholder processes have been traditionally hard to navigate for renewables, but I will say that in recent years. You know, the engagement by the trade groups and the renewable community has stepped up quite a bit at the stakeholder level in RTOs, and actually there have been a lot of positive developments. So I think this is really less of a challenge right now than it has been in years past. We and SIA and many of the folks on the phone have done a great job being heard at the RTOs, and especially in PJM, I would say the leadership and the states have listened to the RTOs and probably listened to the renewable community, and the renewable community is getting its voice heard at the stakeholder level, which is great. Next slide, please. The next slide just shows a summary of the pros and cons, just basically summarizing what I've said, but so you can see that next slide though. And briefly, and this is before I turn over to Jamie to talk about what's going on at the legislative level, and next slide. These are, and this mirrors a lot what Jenny said earlier, but, you know, stakeholders, when they're deciding how to proceed with, you know, wholesale deregulation in the Carolinas, it's important to think about what are the overall goals. Transition costs are going to be an important factor, although there are ways to address transition costs, for example, through securitization and other means that can be less impactful both to the utilities and consumers. So there are ways to do that. Weighing the pros and cons of various options, for example, do you have full-scale integration versus potentially, you know, setting up your own RTO versus having PJM operating a balancing authority as an example. There are a lot of different options to consider and a lot of different flavors of wholesale deregulation. So it's really important to have a thoughtful process in place. And then another question, which we have not touched on here, but just as part of any sort of reform efforts in the power sector, should retail choice, retail market reform be considered as well? That is a whole other topic. It's something outside the scope of this presentation and really outside the authority and jurisdiction of RTOs. But it is something that, as holistically market reform efforts are considered, that's something else that may want to be thought of. But with that, I will turn it back to Weston, and thank you very much for everyone's time.
Hey, Steve, that was great. Thanks very much. Our last speaker is Jamey Goldin, who is a partner in the Columbia office of Nelson Mullins. He previously was Chief Legal Counsel and Chief of Staff at the South Carolina House of Representatives. He also served as Committee Counsel for the SC PERC. Jamey, I will turn it over to you, and I will ask the audience to continue to send us questions. We've got a good list, but keep them coming. Thanks, Jamey.
Thanks, Weston. Thanks, everyone, for attending, devoting your lunch hour and a little bit over that on a Friday in May. I wish we were all in person, but we're not. And so this is our new normal, but I think it's coincidentally timely, given the fact that the South Carolina General Assembly plans to return next Tuesday. And the fact that they will be back, and this bill has been talked about extensively with senators and getting it out there brings us to a timely point to discuss it. So it's very convenient. Next slide, please. So let's start with North Carolina, since they acted before the other Carolinas. House Bill 958 was introduced on April the 25th, 2019 by Representatives Sane, Strickland, and Goodwin. It was referred on the 26th of April to the House Committee on Rules, Calendar, and Operations of the House. Now, that bill, and it is still in committee in North Carolina, would require or set up a stakeholder process, at the North Carolina Public Utilities Commission. And it would also engage a third party, duly qualified and independent consultant to come in and do a study on the benefits and including cost savings, transmission cost savings, reliability and resiliency improvements, and entrance into a regional transmission organization. That bill is a bit different than the one in South Carolina, because at the end of that process, and the stakeholder process would include all of the utilities, the co-ops in North Carolina, consumer advocates, customer representatives. But at the end of that process, upon a finding that entrance into an RTO is in the best interest of the customers of North Carolina, the commission would then have the authority to force the utilities to enter into the into an RTO or create an RTE. That bill has not moved. It was one that has been discussed extensively, and then, as we all know, COVID kind of shut things down and changed the dynamics this year. Representative Zoka, the House Republican leader for North Carolina, has stated publicly, and there's a link in the slide to his comments out of the Charlotte Business Journal, that this bill and legislation, some iteration of it, will be introduced in 2021, and it will be a 2021 issue. And so I think what, for next steps in North Carolina, what we need to work on and what we all need to be focused on is, what does that legislation look like? And that brings me to South Carolina. If you'll go to the next slide. South Carolina has taken a different approach a bit, with both the text of the language and with maybe the number of sponsors and the bipartisan nature of this legislation. In South Carolina, energy issues, clean energy, renewables, access to cheap power, and deregulation, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that word, but market reform measures of sorts should be studied in a bipartisan manner. This is not Republican or Democrat. And to that extent, on the first day of the legislative session this year, on January the 14th, 2020, Senators Tom Davis and Wes Clymer sponsored S998. They were joined in sponsoring that by Senators Campbell, John Matthews, Gregory, Fanning, and Young. And so if you look at that contingent of sponsors, you see several things. The most important, I think, is that they come from both parties, and all of them want to look at what is the best for South Carolinians, what is the best for both the ratepayer and for the renewable community going forward. And that was introduced on January the 14th, 2020. On the next day, January 15th, the House introduced a companion bill with almost identical language, H4940, and that was introduced by Chairman Sandifer, Public Utility Subcommittee Chairman Forrester, Assistant Minority Leader Russell Ott as the primary sponsors, and they were joined by Representatives West, Toole, Norrell, and Funderburg. So again, on the House side, you see a bipartisan effort. You see leadership backing it, just like you do on the Senate side. And so, next slide, please. In coming together, not only has it been bipartisan in nature for wanting to see reform, but it's been driven by interest with competing, but also they all want cheap renewable power. And so you've got these companies listed here in the trade associations that have supported it, and they've supported it from the beginning. They want to see a study on market reform in the Carolinas, and they want to see what comes from it. Are they able to meet their renewable goals easier through a market reform, through an RTO, through an energy imbalance market, and some of the other styles of markets that have been talked about in this presentation. They also want to find what is best for all classes of customers as far as rates. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that. Maybe we'll get some questions. I think I saw some questions coming in on that, and we can certainly address that. But from the beginning, again, you've had a coalition of like-minded businesses that want to see reform studied. Is the vertically integrated monopoly system in the majority of North Carolina and in totality in South Carolina working? And if it's not, or if there's something better, why wouldn't you study that? And so not only has it been bipartisan, been business driven, but next slide, we now have complete unanimity. You're fully unified in South Carolina, and Duke Energy, the coalition that I just mentioned of businesses, Dominion Energy, Nucor, the Electric Cooperatives of South Carolina, South Carolina Solar Business Alliance. Those are just to name a few. I've put in writing to the Senate, to Senator Rankin, Chairman of the Senate Judiciary, that we fully support H4940 with certain amendments, which I'll discuss here briefly, and would ask that they go ahead and pass this bill as amended this session, and let's start the stakeholder process. The Senate, the H4940 crossed over first, and the gentleman's agreement in the South Carolina legislature is whichever bill beats the other one over is the one that moves. And so H4940 made it over in February of this year. The Senate Judiciary Committee met on it, I believe, twice in subcommittee, and they reported it out favorably as amended. Now, the amendments, it differs a bit from North Carolina, and that's why I reference it, because this might be a model that we look at working next year as a consensus bill in North Carolina, but you've got created an electricity market reform measures study committee, and it's comprised of 8 members. 4 members are from the House of Representatives, 4 members are from the Senate. One of those members for each body must represent territory of Dominion Energy. One must represent territory of Duke Energy. Again, we're calling it Duke Energy Collective because that could be Duke Energy Progress or Carolinas. And then one must represent territory that is a direct served customer of Santee Cooper. And finally, one must have territory that is directly served by an electric cooperative. So you've got 8 legislative members with voting capacity representing the state's various balancing authorities and service territories. Then you've got a study committee comprised, in addition, of a non-voting advisory board. And the advisory board is comprised of everyone from the director of the Office of Regulatory Staff, representative from AARP of South Carolina, the Chamber of Commerce of South Carolina, consumer advocates, industrial customers, commercial customers, residential customer representatives, each of the utilities that were previously mentioned and their technical support staff, the cooperatives, Central Electric Cooperative, Santee Cooper, and they will participate. We've lengthened in the Senate, have lengthened, which this was done pre-COVID, but fortunately it was lengthened to meet and issue a report to the General Assembly by November 1, 2021. And upon that, if there is a finding that it is in the public interest and the best interest of the ratepayers of the state of South Carolina, then legislation will be introduced with those findings that would direct the state to enter into an RTO for all or part of the state's service territory. The main thing that this bill has that also the North Carolina legislation has is that it has the independent third-party consultant, because everyone can sit here and have their own opinions about it, but there needs to be someone unbiased brought in. And again, would you spend a penny to possibly save $1,000 on your bill? You'd be foolish not to. And so we have been flooded with post-COVID activity on cost savings, and I've been right in the middle of that, because most people, as we know, in both Carolinas, our utilities have suspended payments, suspended termination for non-payments of their electric customers. And that has begged the question of, when we come back on, or in the light of the looming recession that we could all be facing, how are North Carolinians and South Carolinians going to pay for power? How are small businesses going to get back up and pay for their electricity? And so if there's a way out there to save them any amount of money and to access cleaner energy and to access cheaper energy. Why would we not move on that? That's also by opening up the clean energy economy to a regional market, you're creating jobs. I don't have the figures in front of me, but they're easily available. I think that doing something like this would open up thousands of jobs in the clean energy economy that we currently don't have. And so that's another facet of COVID recovery. The fear was that maybe there would be some momentum loss, and that hardly anything. Everyone has said savings and job creation should be part of any recovery from this pandemic. And this feels like it fits in line. Now, what I would like to say on the record is no one has committed to any outcome of the stakeholder process. Everyone has reserved their rights, and certainly we don't know what the outcome of the study will be, because in the South Carolina version, it leaves all options pretty much on the table, and it leaves those 8 members to vote on what they deem is in the best interest of ratepayers. And so, to that point, we all think that it's worthwhile in studying. We all appreciate that everyone out there is very interested in it, and hence the reason for a robust stakeholder process to take place. We look forward to doing that here in South Carolina over the next 2 years, and working in conjunction with North Carolina next year to get the bill passed there and to get that study up and running too, because the 2 Carolinas moving in sync obviously would be very nice to do, so that we can fully vet this. Next slide.
And Jamie, this is just a prompt to get you to wrap it up, just so we'll have some time for questions, because we've got a hard stop at 1:30.
Good deal. I'll turn it over to you, Weston.
Sorry to intervene like that. So I've got a ton of questions here. I'm just going to dive in here, and I will make the point that we will we'll send everybody the slides on the other side of this, so you will get the slides. I've had a couple of questions on that. First question for the whole panel: what recommendations would you make to policymakers who are trying to achieve clean energy policy objectives and make those objectives seamlessly work with a competitive marketplace? And that's for anybody.
So this is Steve. I think that actually, the competitive marketplace is conducive and works with clean energy policies. I think the competitive markets actually facilitate clean energy. To the extent you're looking at what particular, and maybe this is an allusion to what's going on in the capacity market, but in PJM, however, just because a state has clean energy policies does not mean that the capacity market cancels it out. It can be made more difficult to implement. However, I think, as I meant, as I said earlier, there's going to be a lot of movement around the capacity market. There's a lot of discussion in the stakeholder process. I think that, so I think that there's going to be some development on that. But I think, the competitive market facilitates clean energy in the first place. I think, though, another thing that actually we haven't talked about it as much, is the prospect of carbon pricing. So a few weeks ago, there was a request for a technical conference on FERC filed by a host of stakeholders, including AWEA and actually EPSA, which is basically the Natural Gas Supply Association, asking FERC to have a technical conference on the concept of carbon pricing. That is something that I think has some promise as well in terms of states looking to push for some policies that could be aligned better with the competitive market structure. So that's something. There have been carbon pricing discussions going on in New York ISO and PJM at the stakeholder level. There's also been that request for technical conference at FERC that's outstanding. Comments on that are due, I think, next week. So I think if we are talking about specific policy goals, I think a carbon price would actually be another one that'd be good. But even if you don't have that, I do think that the competitive market structure actually facilitates can help to facilitate clean energy goals.
Got it. All right, so we might move to another question here. This question is posed as following. there recently have been concerns about exiting RTOs because of over-procurement and capacity issues. This is for Jenny. Jenny, do you think this is an issue for the Southeast?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I almost included a map in my presentation of the levels of reserve margins across the United States. And when you look at the amount of extra capacity across the United States, it's pretty much consistently a lot of surplus capacity. So for example, in the Southeast, you might have around, and these are figures from NERC data in 2019, around 29, 28%. PJM might be around the same numbers. And so the question is always, well, who's paying for that extra capacity? So when you have a lot of capacity in a vertically integrated structure, customers are often on the hook to pay for it. In a capacity market, it's not necessarily the customers that are taking all of the risk. However, the capacity markets have been an issue in overprocurement, and we know of ways to fix the overprocurement. And so there have been a lot of efforts in trying to bring that excess capacity down. And just to really quickly touch on the capacity market point, when you look at the amount of a customer's bill that is that goes to the capacity market, in PJM in 2018, it's about 10–13%. I would echo Steve's point that the energy markets and ancillary services markets do a lot to facilitate flexibility of the system and thus help clean energy technologies, especially ones that are low marginal cost technologies. With the capacity markets, if they are procuring a certain kind of capacity, it's not that the states are not able to procure their own capacity. They can still procure wind and solar resources, but if these are not being cleared in the capacity market, there's going to be a little bit of excess capacity, or a lot, depending on how much renewable energy resources that they're trying to get. So the question is really, the states can go ahead and do what they want with what they want to procure, but the question is, are we procuring too much in the capacity market? And so there are groups that are trying to fix that level of procurement in the various capacity markets. Thanks.
Yeah.
Jenny,
Go ahead, Steve.
So I was just going to say one clarifying point to that, and Jenny, I agree with everything that you said. One thing that clarifies that, and I think the question was also, are people leaving PJM? And I think, and this is actually one of the options that everyone should be aware of, is that this is what's been written about the FRR options, but states are considering whether to effectively carve themselves out of the capacity market that is allowed under PJM's current rules. And that is something that, as hopefully the study moves forward in the Carolinas, that could be a potential option to consider, given what's going on in FERC and the capacity market design. And that's really what state, at least to date, what several states are thinking about is there an option to carve themselves the capacity market, but also looking at that, what are the total costs to consumers in doing that? Because there are some potential drawbacks. So just want to give that added clarity as well.
No, that's helpful. And Steve, here's a follow-up for you. If the Carolinas were to start a new RTO, how could they leapfrog or potentially improve existing RTO market rule issues?
Great question. I think that, if they were to form their own, it goes back to Jenny's points, which is, what are your goals? If your goals are to, reduce customer costs and also increase renewables, let's say that those are your dual goals. I think keeping SCED in place is vitally important. That's, the Security Strained Economic Dispatch. I think having a capacity market the way that it is currently structured, and remember, some of this is not just PJM, a lot of this is also FERC, to be quite candid. But either having no capacity market or having some sort of revised design of a capacity market would be helpful, just to not have the over-procurement issues Jenny was talking about. The one thing I will say, though, also, one of the drawbacks potentially of a Carolinas only RTO versus integrating into a larger RTO such as PJM is you won't get, and this is something that needs to be studied. I think that's important. This is one of the reasons, as Jamie pointed out, it's important to have a study to look at this, to compare costs and benefits to one another, is that you wouldn't get all of the benefits of having the broader dispatch over a wider geographic range. Typically, longer dispatch over larger geographic range helps to, integrate renewables, helps with grid flexibility, helps with reliability. So if you were to have, if the two options were a Carolinas only RTO versus the Carolinas joining PJM, those are the types of analyses that would need to be done in order to see what's best for Carolinians. And that's certainly part of the legislation that we're looking to pass. That's the type of analysis that would need to be done. But excellent question.
And this is for Rachel. Quickly, Rachel, this is probably our last question. And I don't think anybody's addressed this yet, but can you provide the net benefits to Duke of joining PJM?
I think I mentioned that in, I'm sorry. So the discussion around the net benefits to Duke was resulting from the savings that they could then, they would have two options. One would be returning that savings to customers, which is what they did in the case of the merger in 2012. And the second thing, which I touched on, is reinvesting that capital into grid modernization investments and other alternative type investments that could then make the grid function more efficiently and could potentially result in additional savings to consumers.
All right, and one last question, and this is Rachel or Jenny. Have either of you looked at the transmission costs of joining PJM?
Just based off of MISO's breakdown, cost benefit breakdown, the total costs that they include are roughly 10% of the total benefits. I haven't looked at particular transmission costs, and certainly maybe it's a better question for Rachel because the transmission costs can depend on the modeling and the configuration that you have before you. But for example, in the historic case of Entergy joining either MISO or SPP, they did do a lot of transmission modeling, and or they did the modeling, and they thought that it would be better to join SPP. They joined MISO, and they did find that that the cost benefit still worked out, even though they thought that it would cost too much in transmission.
And also,
Rachel might have
anything you want to add to that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just say two things about that. The first is that in the study that we did, we assume existing transmission and the existing capacity of those transmission lines. So all of the imports and exports occur over what currently exists in terms of transmission. And secondly, I referred to the 2012 merger, and Duke was required also in that merger to undergo certain transmission investments. And so, that sort of thing would certainly be necessary here as well. We just haven't yet quantified the magnitude of such a cost.
Very good. And I think we're going to wrap on that point. It's been an hour and a half. We will get the slides to those folks, basically to everybody who's on the call. We'll send you the slides. And thank you for joining us for this Nelson Mullins webinar. We enjoyed having you all. Thanks very much.